Good evening, everyone. I'm David James. I'd like to welcome you to this Institution of Engineering and Technology Sussex Network talk. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Harish Godaba, who is a lecturer in the Department of Engineering and Design at the University of Sussex. He received his PhD from the National University of Singapore in 2018. Prior to joining the University of Sussex, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at Queen Mary University of London and the National University of Singapore. His work has been published in reputed venues such as Nature Materials, Soft Matter, Applied Physics Letters, and IEEE ASME transactions on mechatronics. His research focuses on investigating the intersection of functional materials, applied mechanics, and bioinspiration to develop intelligent soft robots and devices to tackle significant challenges in industrial and biomedical applications. So now I'll stop sharing my desktop and we'll ask Harish to share his.
Thank you very much, James, for your introduction. And hello everyone to all the attendees. I am Dr. Harish Godaba. I'm a lecturer in University of Sussex, and I will today I will briefly discuss and introduce you to several of the soft material technologies that I've worked on during the course of my research career on that are related to developing the next generation of bio-inspired robots. So the brief list of contents that we will discuss today is basically I will introduce you to dielectric elastomer artificial muscles, which forms a crux of my research work, and then I will talk about some of our recent work on stretchable self-healing electroluminescent devices, and then discuss about how soft robotic solutions that are inspired by nature and developed from soft material technologies can help us in solving significant field robotics challenges. So firstly, let's take a look at this interesting video. So this is shot underwater by marine biologist Roger T. Hanlon. So if you look closely to what's going to emerge, so basically there is an octopus hiding there in plain sight, and if you look at this, it has many interesting peculiar characteristics it's exhibiting. So first, of course, the very evident thing is camouflage here, right? And besides that, you can see that it's not just camouflage from color, but also there is morphological changes in the texture of the body of this octopus that can help it camouflage so excellently in nature. And then when it begins to move, we can see how its soft morphology, its soft body and anatomy helps it to have very versatile motions in water. It can also sort of walk on the floor of this of subsea environments. And also you may have seen some interesting videos where octopus can enter some very confined environments, like they can enter through pieces of bottles under the water. They're also able to open the jar of a bottle and emerge from inside it. So basically they have some very amazing capabilities which are linked with many different characteristics that we might desire in the synthetic devices and robots that we build. So some of the diverse range of capabilities that we can talk about are that we see in the octopus are actuation, right? It has distributed actuation throughout its body. Then it has compliance, which allows it to interact safely and in a versatile nature with the environment. Then there are also proprioceptive and exteroceptive sensing, basically sensors that allow these organisms or species to basically sense the locations of all the parts of the body, and exteroceptive is to sense the external environment. Then there are the power sources, the biological power sources that basically power all the creatures. And then there is also some sort of computation, although from neural mechanisms, but there is computation happening in the body. And finally, there are also other interesting features such as camouflage, right, color change that we also see in nature. So I will briefly discuss how different soft robotics technologies or soft material-based technologies help us to develop new capabilities in these different domains of actuation, compliance, sensing, and camouflage. Okay. Yeah. So firstly, starting with the actuation, I'd like to introduce you to this class of class of artificial muscles known as dielectric elastomers, or basically there's a class of soft actuators that are known as dielectric elastomers. So the inspiration for this is basically from looking at nature. If you see our current day machines or robots, a lot of them are rigid. We extensively use electromagnetic motors in our robots and machines. But if you look at our counterparts in nature, for example, just the human arm and muscles, you would see that these are soft, right? Our human muscles are soft. You can see this, the cardiac muscle or the human heart. It can pump blood consistently, and the durability is also very long. Can be 100 years for many, right? And if you look at the caterpillar, it exhibits such versatile locomotion over unstructured terrains like this twig, plants, and so on, that we would really be in awe of if we are able to replicate them in synthetic devices like robots, right? And then if you look at this plant in nature, which is called as the touch me not plant, when we touch it, even without any neural or nervous system, just the mechanics of this plant allows it to curl up when there is an external physical stimuli and keep itself safe. So these natural organisms and creatures, they give us some interesting ideas on what we can aspire to achieve in the devices that we are trying and hoping to develop, right? So how do we go towards that? So thankfully, in the last several decades, there have been a lot of advances that are ongoing on soft active materials. So basically, soft active materials are materials that respond to some stimuli, okay, and they exhibit response, such as elongation, bending, and shape change. And we can use this mechanical response to drive work. So here we have shape memory polymers. When we heat them or cool them, basically when they're exposed to change in temperature, they can exhibit some deformation. And then hydrogels, they can swell in different pH, and that can drive mechanical work. And finally, the subject of my interest is the dielectric elastomer. These dielectric elastomers can respond to change in electric field or electric voltage. Okay, so as you see here, this is a dielectric elastomer actuator without any voltage applied, and when we apply a high voltage, this expands. Okay, and we can use this expansion or this change in its configuration to drive mechanical work. Yeah, and here is this artificial muzzle or dielectric elastomer in action. Yeah, so how it works is basically this is a stretchable polymer film, or as we call this class of materials, elastomers. So they can stretch and then they can recover their initial reference configuration when we remove the external loads. And then we coat this elastomer membrane with compliant electrode. So electrode is basically conducting material on the top and the bottom of this film. And now when we apply a voltage across these two conductive layers, basically this is now like a parallel plate capacitor, right? So there are charges formed, and there is electric field that is formed along the thickness direction. And then basically you can imagine as if this charges basically compress this membrane, and because this elastomer is incompressible, the elastomer stretches in the area direction and basically this expands. So this is basically how this dielectric elastomer works. And here you can see when we apply a high voltage, there are these electrostatic charges that are generated, which basically generate this Maxwell stress. This is also called Maxwell stress, which expands the membrane. So basically this actuator, we can use this expansion to drive mechanical work. And why this actuator is very interesting is if you look at this this actuation strain versus actuation pressure density figure, we can see that uh, basically the dielectric elastomers, they spread across the range of natural muscles. So the actuation strain can be 10 to 100%. Actually, it can be as high as 500% linear strain, while natural muscles are generally 30 to 50% contraction strain. And then the actuation pressure per density or per weight is also quite similar to that of natural muscles. So these possibly can be excellent contenders for driving soft and compliant robots. And as I mentioned, the energy density is very high. The response is also significantly relatively high compared to many actuators. They can go up to several kilohertz. You can also develop loudspeakers by using this type of artificial muscles. Then, because these are very thin films of elastomer, we can make compact multi-layer structures, which can help to basically increase the force outputs of this kind of actuators. And the density is close to that of water, so it's lightweight. And also these are naturally we have a variety of natural and synthetic elastomers that we can use for these actuators. For example, natural rubber, 3Ms, very high bonding double-side adhesive tape is also a common actuator that's material that's used to make these dielectric elastomer actuators. So I would like to discuss a bit on some of the efforts that I've been a part of in trying to achieve large voltage-induced deformation in these elastomers. Okay, so as you can see here, we know that if you take an elastomer, or basically a natural rubber membrane, and we stretch it, the force stretch curve looks like this. Initially it is stiff, then the polymer has some softening behavior, and finally when we are close to the stretch limit, it will be very stiff like this. And the failure is basically accounted by wherever the tensile strength of this material is, right? Or the rupture stress will once that is reached, there'll be a rupture. Now we could imagine trying to do something very similar, but by using electric field. So as I mentioned in the discussion earlier, actually when we have an electric voltage across the two compliant electrodes, what happens is there is a stress that is generated in the aerial direction that will basically pull the membrane. So we could try to achieve something similar. And then the failure mode is basically once the electric field is very large, then there is a dielectric breakdown, okay, which is similar to the breakdown of air during arc welding. So we can have similar breakdown, dielectric breakdown in these polymers or in these elastomers. And what we have seen is that the traditional limit for dielectric elastomer actuator is related to this breakdown, but it's related in a sort of peculiar way. When the force stretch curve is non-linear like this, or basically non-linear like this, then the corresponding voltage versus stretch, or the voltage versus expansion curve, looks something like this. It is an N-shaped curve. So now what we do is when we slowly apply the voltage, right, the stretch will continue to increase until it comes to this peak of this N-shaped curve. And once the voltage is further increased, you'll see that there is no stable state close to the stretch. So the membrane tries to jump to this very large stretch state. And during that process, the membrane also thins, right? Because the elastomer is incompressible. But as the membrane thins, it is possible that it will encounter dielectric breakdown before it reaches the next stable state. So the largest observable stretch will be this lambda small that is pointed by this N-shaped curve. And this comes to about just 30% linear strain, which generally was the traditional limit of this type of dielectric elastomer actuators. So generally, once we get this 30% strain, there is breakdown, and then the membrane obviously cannot stretch any further. Then people tried to look at different ways to actually increase this actuation strain, and people found that if we actually apply some initial pre-stretch, either by stretching the membrane and clamping on a frame, or by applying some preload, which will basically keep the initial state of the membrane slightly larger than 1.3 stretch, what will happen is now this nonlinear curve that we see here, it becomes actually monotonic, and then you can actually go all the way until breakdown. So you can achieve a much higher actuation strain. So people found that you can achieve more than 100%, and in this equibiaxial case, you can achieve as high as more than 400% aerial strain. But then these techniques, they're generally about avoiding this type of N-shaped curve, basically avoiding this instability called as electromechanical instability. Yeah, but then the clue to how to actually even harness this type of instability to achieve large deformation is basically in the mechanics of this elastomer balloons. Okay, so if you remember the last time you tried to inflate this rubber balloon, maybe as a kid, you would remember that initially this type of balloon is very difficult to inflate, but then once you begin to inflate it with some air, it becomes very simple. It becomes quite soft, right? And then finally it begins to become stiffer again. So that is because the PV curve, or the pressure volume curve of these balloons, is also N-shaped like this. So here, basically at some intermediate volumes, the pressure required to sustain that volume or to increase that volume is very, very low, which is why it is quite easy to inflate balloon in this intermediate volume state. So now what we figured, so normally if on the other hand, instead of inflating by increasing the volume, if you actually connect the balloon to pressure regulator and you slowly begin to increase the pressure, what you will see is that once the volume reaches this state, or once the pressure reaches this point, and you slightly increase the pressure, there is no stable state close to this. So the membrane basically jumps to this very large volume state, and this is called a snap-through expansion of balloon. So basically some researchers found out that if we can actually use this snap-through expansion and control the pressure the pressure volume loading curve, we can actually achieve a safe snap-through. So what they did was they put this type of balloon on a very large volume chamber, so that the pressure versus volume curve is basically as the gas inside this chamber, it follows the PV law, ideal gas law. So there is a PV path that is corresponding to this variable chamber volume, so that you can achieve a snap through such that the next stable state still falls before the dielectric breakdown. And what this helps us to achieve is that we can actually realize this large volume state that is still not at which the dielectric breakdown still does not happen. So using this technique, quite a large area strain was achieved, but then the drawback is that it needs a very, very large air chamber. For example, for a small balloon of radius 2.25 centimeter, we need a chamber of volume 20,000 centimeter cube. It is a very huge volume in comparison. So in my work, what we did was we basically looked to see if there are other methods through which we can achieve snap through. And what we figured is that um, in this PV curve that we see, if you basically put the membrane very, very close to the verge of instability, which is basically very close to the top of this N-shaped curve, and then we can actually use a very small voltage to trigger this snap through and basically end up on this other side of the curve, which basically gives us very large volume change. So what we did is we designed some experimental setup where we have this elastomer membrane that is coupled to a chamber of fluid, okay? And once the area of this fluid is relatively large compared to this, when this membrane expands due to application of voltage, the change in this height will be very, very minimal, and basically we can maintain constant pressure. So when we do this, what we saw is that when we have the pressure, the initial pressure quite close to snap through, when we have an initial pressure very low, what happens is no matter how much voltage you apply, the membrane will try to increase, but it will never reach snap through, and it will just break down before it can get any large volume change. So the volume change is very small. And at very large initial pressure, what happens is the membrane already undergoes snap through, so there is no more actuation you can get, which will also be very small. But at an intermediate pressure, which is basically at the verge of this instability, if you keep the initial pressure such that it is close to the snap through pressure, then we can apply very small voltage, and then that can trigger this snap through, which can help us achieve a very large volume change. So this is basically snap through instability at constant pressure by basically controlling what is the initial pressure. And once we saw this, we realized, okay, we can actually have this actuator that's coupled with fluid, and we can also achieve large volume change by triggering this snap through. So then we collaborated with colleagues in biomedical engineering, and we basically worked on developing fluid pumps that have potential application for cardiac assist device. So in one of the works, we basically utilize this reversible snap through actuation to achieve a large volume fluid pump. Basically, the snap through increases the volume change, and also it increases the flow rate of the fluid basically by using this snap through actuation. And then this initial membrane that we used, which you can see here, is basically dielectric, is basically 3M's double-sided bonding tape. However, this material has high viscoelasticity, or it is highly viscous in nature, so the hysteresis and energy dissipation is high. But however, for a fluid pump, we would want reasonably higher actuation speed. So what we did was we engineered a composite dielectric elastomer membrane where we combine the soft and slightly viscous 3M's VHB with a stiff and elastic band from a company called Oppo, which is basically the band people use for physiotherapy. It's a physiotherapy band. And once we combine these two together, we're actually able to also tune the resonant frequency of this pump to achieve significantly higher flow rate as compared to just 3M's VHB. So these were conducted in application to developing cardiac assist device, because a lot of the rotary flow pumps, they can basically shear the blood, which creates hemo damage. However, we think an actuator that is more like our natural muscle can actually reduce this type of shear stresses on the fluid and keep the blood safe for longer. So in another application of this dielectric elastomer actuators, I worked on developing an underwater robot that is inspired by the jellyfish. So for the jellyfish, they basically exhibit up and down motions, and for long distance movements underwater, they rely a lot on the water currents to transport them over long distances. And then they have two different type of motion. One is basically they have this padding motion to generate thrust force, and basically the water ejection can also generate thrust force. So what we did is slightly inspired by the jellyfish, but then also getting in some other ideas from based on these actuators. What we did is we developed this type of structure where we have a small air chamber um, that is enclosed inside a dome like this, and then we have a initially pressurized dielectric elastomer membrane attached to this chamber. Now, when we apply voltage to this elastomer membrane, the membrane increases in volume. And when this increases in volume, there are two forces that are generated. First is the fluid is basically pumped out of this from the bottom through the apertures here. This creates thrust force. And then because the volume of this membrane has changed or increased, it also creates some additional buoyant force that can make this robot move up, right? So we basically looked at these two types of forces. It is relatively, it's quite reasonably fast actuation, less than 100 milliseconds, so which can actually give us rapid movement of water from inside this bell. And then also from some modeling uh, based on the mechanics of these elastomers and then the PV gas law, what we found is that even for this, we have an optimal pressure that can help us to achieve the largest, basically the largest buoyant force. And then we tested this underwater, and you will see that at the start there is a sudden jerk, which is basically created due to the thrust force that is generated just by suddenly actuating the membrane. And after that, when the voltage is constant, but then there is a constant buoyant force that is acting on the membrane that basically is basically acting on the chamber that can make this robot move up in water. And we see that for a self weight of basically we can have a payload of 2.36 Newton for this type of setup. And then further inspired by how the natural jellyfish moves, this was an experiment that's created in the lab to see how we can also make a deformable bell based on this artificial muzzle. And actually the voltage is 6000 volt um, at a frequency of 0.75 hertz, and we can actually generate sufficient deformation to make this kind of setup to move. Yeah, and then further for other applications of these dielectric elastomers, we've tried to develop biomimetic actuators for omnidirectional motion of the eyeballs. So if you look at trying to make synthetic eyeballs, maybe for camera positioning or other applications based on electric motors and transmission mechanisms, what we'll see is that to achieve this type of omnidirectional motion, the transmission mechanism can be bulky and heavy. But basically looking at the extraocular muscles in the eyeballs, we got inspired to actually make an omnidirectional eyeball actuator that is quite small and compact. Inside the um, um, inside the human skull, we have these three pairs of extraocular muscles that can help us move the eyeball right to left, up and down, and also an oblique motion. And what we did is we basically developed this spring roll type of actuators. Basically, there's a spring and a rolled dielectric elastomer membrane around each of these, and by combining three, we can actually make an actuator that can move this eyeball. And here in the top video, you see an actress doing this interesting eye movements. And here we have this recreated by using our robotic eyeballs. Basically, these are eyeballs that are moved by this dielectric elastomer actuators. Yeah, and then the advantage is these are silent. There is no noise, and they can be quite compact. Yeah, and further from there, yeah, this is to show that we can also utilize this type of dielectric elastomer actuators for high frequency applications. So here in this left side figure, we basically studied the dynamics of this type of system, and we figured that we can develop a tactile feedback device that can generate forces greater than 6 Newton at more than 100 Hertz frequency. And for this, we also did some tests and found that the media that connects, so here we have the dielectric elastomer actuator with a mass that vibrates, and then this is a media or an elastic media that connects this to the user here. And this media is the stiffness of this media is very important and on what type of output forces this type of device can generate. And here we have, in another study, we have pursued applications of this dielectric elastomers to make a broadband acoustic duct silencer. So here what we did is we basically covered a Helmholtz resonator with a dielectric elastomer actuator that is already pre-stretched with electrode coated on both sides. Now basically what happens is when you have a pre-stretched membrane and when you apply voltage, the electromechanical stress that is generated, it basically helps to remove the mechanical stress or basically counteract the mechanical stress, and the membrane can become soft. So by this, we can tune what is the apparent stiffness of this membrane. And just by doing this, we can basically change the resonance frequency of this type of duct silencer. So what we can do is we can have a duct silencer whose resonant frequency for attenuation, it can basically be changed by controlling the voltage input to this dielectric elastomer actuator. And we also found some dependence of that of this resonance shift on the initial pre-stretch of the membrane. So basically that's what we have, some of the brief insights into this dielectric elastomer actuators, muzzles, and different bio-inspired applications that we have pursued. Currently, we're still continuing to work further on improving these dielectric elastomer actuators, developing embedded sensors for them, and also further pursuing the underwater robotic applications that I've briefly pointed at so far. Now I will move to discuss about another work that I've been part of, which is on developing soft and stretchable electroluminescent devices. So firstly, we can see that there is a movement that is basically that's quite interesting in the consumer sphere, which is that people are very keen on, are very interested on wearable displays, and along with that, there is also a lot of interest from consumer companies like LG and Samsung who are interested in developing displays which are bendable and also even stretchable. So this is a movement that is going on currently. And why do we need this type of bendable or stretchable displays? First is, if you have stretchable displays, they can be convenient to have them on a body for wearable applications. And maybe we can have this future realistic electronic newspapers that are more close to what we have today. And then we can also have robots that can basically use these, soft robots like this, which can basically utilize these color changes for communication and so on. For example, some underwater organisms also use light as a mode of communication. And also potentially some 3D morphable surfaces which can also display colors and so on. So the stretchable displays, as we see, can have some interesting future technological applications. So there have been many different ways that people have been pursuing to develop stretchable displays or stretchable display technologies. So three most popular ones are light-emitting electrochemical cells, stretchable polymer LEDs, and AC or alternating current electroluminescent displays. So each of them have each of them has their own advantages and disadvantages. A key challenge for LECs or light emitting electrochemical cells and stretchable LEDs is basically that the stretchability is quite limited, and at higher strains the luminance or the ability to generate the intensity of light that's generated, they go down drastically. For AC electroluminescent displays, however, the lifetimes can be high and the stretchability can be very high. So they can be stretched to quite a large stretch, which can be quite useful for wearable as well as soft robotic applications to actually use this for synthetic robots. And then a common challenge for all these type of stretchable display technologies is that if there's a mechanical damage, it limits the lifetime of these devices significantly, right? So for us, because these AC electroluminescent displays have high stretchability, we've actually focused um, on basing um, on this technology to develop stretchable high luminescence and also self-healing displays, which I will discuss in just a moment. So firstly, these are the main components of a alternating current electroluminescent display. The first is basically these alternating current electroluminescent displays. These are also like these dielectric elastomers in a way. They're basically a dielectric with a phosphorescent or a semiconductor particle. So these phosphors are basically semiconductor particles, and then we need to have electrodes on both sides. And then when you apply a AC voltage across these two electrodes, then light is emitted from the semiconductor region. So of course, for the light to transmit to the viewer, we need to have a transparent conductive layer, right? So the conductive layer has to be transparent. The dielectric matrix also needs to be transparent, and it needs to be an insulator. And then we need to have some semiconductor particles or electroluminescent particles that can basically emit light. And here you can see this is a traditional stiff or rigid ACEL electroluminescent device. We have ITO, indium tin oxide, a transparent conductive electrode, and glass. So then and top electrode can be metal because this was on the background, right? So there were even color televisions that were developed based on AC electroluminescent devices. So Sharp was the company to first develop ACEL based TV. Okay, and now if you want to make a ACEL device that is actually stretchable, basically the challenge is all these parts, they need to be stretchable, right? So the key challenges in actually developing a stretchable electroluminescent device is that we need to have this dielectric matrix, right? Most of the soft materials, the dielectric permittivity of the elastomer is low, which may actually results in low luminescence. And then because of that, we need high AC electric field to excite the luminescent centers, and the frequency so that the intensity is in the visible threshold is quite high. So we need a kilohertz range AC signal, which is again also of a high voltage. And high leakage currents can also cause dielectric degradation. If there are high leakage currents, this can cause also heat in the elastomer, which can cause it to break down. Okay. And besides this, we again need to make sure that if you want to develop a stretchable electroluminescent device, all the three parts, so the conductive layer, the dielectric matrix, basically these two parts, they need to be transparent and with relatively high transparency. And then we also need to figure out how can we embed these semiconductor particles or electroluminescent phosphors into this transparent stretchable dielectric layer. So these are some of the key challenges that we encounter when we're trying to develop stretchable electroluminescent devices. Yeah, so in a work that we conducted back when I was in National University of Singapore, um, we've actually come up with with a with this new device called as the healable device, which we've named it as as Helios. So basically, this is a healable low field illuminating optoelectronic stretchable device. So basically, we nicknamed it as Helios. So the main characteristics is that it has a very ultra low light up voltage, so it can light up at just 23 volt, and it can operate at frequencies well below 1 kilohertz. So these are basically safe operating conditions. So in general, this can operate at conditions that are safe for human machine interaction. The brightness is 1460 candela per meter square. For most mobile phones, if you got 1000 CD per meter square, this is sufficient for mobile phone displays. And then this can light up even at 800% linear strain. Then the most interesting characteristics is it is intrinsically self-healing. You cut it and it automatically heals. And optoelectronic healing efficiency, which is the intensity of light that is generated after cutting and healing, is again 100%. So it can recover its full capability of generating luminescence. Yeah, so here are the various parts that go into making, or materials that go into making this Helios device. First is we need a dielectric material. So we use this PVDF based fluoroelastomer, which is called PVDF HFP. And then we basically mixed in this non-ionic fluorosurfactant called as Zonil FS300. So what this does is it makes this polymer chains a bit mobile, which actually helps in self-healing. So when we cut it, then the mobile polymer chains can help them to self-heal. So basically, this is the material that helps to make this self-healing, this device self-healing. And both this together are solution processed in acetone. Then for the conductor, or for the conductive layer, as you can see here, which we name as the electrode, we also use a similar base material, the same base material called PVDF HFP. But instead of this non-ionic fluorosurfactant, to make it conductive, we use an ionic liquid that basically makes this material conductive. And as an interesting byproduct sort of function, what we found is that this ionic liquid also helps to make this conductor self-healing. So ionic liquid also has some surfactant type properties which actually makes also this conductor self-healing. And this is also solution processed in acetone. And finally, for this intermediate layer, we use this electroluminescent phosphors. So you can see we have blue, for blue we have ZNS, zinc sulfide doped with copper, and orange doped with copper and manganese. And these are, you can see, around 20 micron or smaller semiconductor phosphor particles. So these are embedded into this dielectric material. And yeah, now when you apply AC voltage, what will happen is it will trigger these electroluminescent centers, and it generates light that can basically emit through this transparent electrode. And here you can see a video of this. So this basically a normal mobile phone in daylight. And here on the right side we have the Helios device which we've developed, and on the left you have a control group which is another EL device with a different dielectric that was used before in literature. And you can see that the Helios material is significantly brighter compared to the control group. And we actually see that the voltage and the switching frequency is quite low compared to most of the other works in this domain. Yeah, so looking at the reason for this, yeah, first, if you see on the left hand side, you can see that this Helios material, the luminescence is far higher than most of the other um, uh, electroluminescent materials that are described in literature. So the reason is the this Ecoflex EL, which I've shown here as a control group. For example, this material has dielectric permittivity less than 3. But for this Helios, once we have this PVDF mixed with FS300, we actually see that the dielectric permittivity can more than 20, or even more than 10, even in high frequency region, which basically increases the charge carrying capacity so much, and this basically helps to achieve a high luminescence. So the improved dielectric constant is a key reason for this. Yeah, and then as mentioned, the stretchability is very high. We can stretch this to 800% and it can still light up. And let's look at the intrinsic self-healing behavior. So if you just cut the material into 2 halves, and then basically remove this, and then again put them together, and this is basically pulling this apart immediately. So what we can see is that it almost immediately begins to rebond to the in the cut regions. So that's the interesting part, that it starts to heal almost immediately. Of course, if you leave it for 3 hours, you will see that the bond is now very strong, and you can see that it has significantly high strength at the interface, so that when we stretch it, the interface does not tear apart. So this is about the intrinsic self-healing behavior. So why we call it intrinsic is we do not need to trigger any heat or external stimuli like that for this self-healing behavior to take place. And then this is basically how the strength of this material regains. You can see that after 24 hours, it regains about half of its initial stretchability when cut. And if you actually have temperature of 50 degrees Celsius, it can regain close to its initial strength. Yeah, and then this basically shows the optical healing. So this is basically even after multiple cuts, we basically measure the intensity of light that is generated by this device before and after cut, and we see that even after multiple cuts, the optical healing is quite high. So after 3 cuts and healing, the optical intensity that's generated is still close to 100%. Yeah, so we've taken this electroluminescent device and tried to apply this to develop an application in soft robotic devices. So what we did is we basically tried to make a proximity sensing capability by utilizing this stretchable light source. So what we did is we took these stretchable light sources and embedded them in a pneumatic gripper, which is basically a gripper made of stretchable material. When we apply pressure, the fingers bend to basically grasp some object, and then we added a photo detector so that the light emitting from this Helios device can reflect off the surface on the environment and reach back to this photo detector. So when it comes close to an object, we can see high intensity, which will help us to detect whether the object is in position or not. And then since we wanted to make use of this self-healing capability to basically make this gripper more resilient, what we did is we also made this gripper from material that is puncture resistant. So if we take a normal silicone material like Ecoflex, and then we add cellulose fibers, so it generates a matrix that basically can make this materials puncture resistant. So then taking these two together, we develop this type of gripper. Yeah, so here we have a photo detector, and here we have the embedded soft stretchable light sources. Yeah, and basically the idea is when it is close to an object, it can indicate by this blinking to give a signal to grasp the object. So now basically this in the bottom you see the light sensor signal. And once this is close to this apple, you can see that the light intensity increases. And once this is very high, we know that it is close enough to the object we'd like to grasp. And then we can lower the gripper to basically grasp the object. So this can help to actually do this kind of proximity sensing in the dark. And yeah, here is basically demonstrating this puncture resistant property that is achieved both by the puncture resistant gripper and the self-healing Helios device. So as you can see, we basically poke this gripper and the Helios device through with a sharp needle, and even then this can still light up. And yeah, when you remove, you see that it lights up as well as before, which is basically almost recovering all of its optical uh, functionality. Yeah, and then yeah, this is to basically grasp a balloon, and you'll be able to see now that when we puncture all the way through the balloon, the gripper and the Helios or the lighting device can still continue to act. Yeah. So of course, this is more of a interesting demonstration to show that once we have this capability, we can actually uh, basically tackle applications where the resilience of the gripper can be more important. For example, we can actually realistically think of grasping sharp objects without being afraid that this may damage the soft robotic devices we're utilizing. Yeah, so that is mainly a discussion about the um, electroluminescent, stretchable self-healing electroluminescent devices. So I think I will take 10 more minutes to talk a little bit about another emerging field that we're quite interested in, which is on developing soft robots for field applications. So one of the projects that I've been part of during my postdoc was the National Center for Nuclear Robotics project, and also now I'm a co-I on a nuclear decommissioning project funded by the EPSRC. So many of you may be aware that there's a gargantuan nuclear decommissioning task that is ongoing in the UK. The more than 10 sites across the UK, and then the nuclear fuel storage ponds, waste silos built in the 40s and the 50s, and there is the fuel fabrication and reprocessing plants and a fleet of waste storage facilities that need to be decommissioned. And in 2019, it was forecast that this future cleanup will cost more than 124 billion pounds and spread across the next 120 years. So this is a gargantuan task of significant importance. And some of the important challenges in nuclear decommissioning are basically um, a lot of these areas have high radiation, so there are hazardous effects of radiation which can degrade electronics and robotic components. And then the wastes are of a very wide variety. So there are a wide variety of wastes, which means a lot of the grasping, identification, and grasping challenges also in terms of the mechanical um, device are quite complicated. And then relatively the unstructured environments, this is still a reasonably good structure, but then if you look at old plants that are in the need of decommissioning, or places where there have been accidents such as the Fukushima disaster or the Windscale piles accident in the UK, these are significantly more challenging for robots to enter and conduct any tasks. So some of the requirements of robotic solutions are they need to be radiation tolerant in some areas. Then because of the unstructured environment, and also because of the wide variety of wastes, we would like them to be compliant and robust to impacts, and then also safe for the environment so that they do not cause additional damage due to collisions and so on. So yeah, one of the interesting areas is soft manipulator systems. So there are several areas in the nuclear plants where novel sensor delivery robots are needed to access difficult spaces, internal inspection of contaminated pipework, penetrating high-dose environments, accessing high regions, and so on. So there are many challenges for soft manipulator systems. And in addition to that, novel grasping along with sensorization that can be radiation tolerant can also um, improve this kind of the execution of these decommissioning tasks. So in the Enciana project, one of the combined soft robotic approach we came up with basically revolves around remote actuation and sensing. So the idea is like this. We have some hazardous area that can be behind walls. The walls can also be very thick, for example. And then we have a remote control area where we can house all the electronics and a lot of the things we need to work with. But then basically connecting these two, we need to have soft and flexible manipulators that can basically enter into this hazardous area. And these are actuated remotely, either by, mostly by pneumatic or tendon-driven mechanisms, so that we can basically actuate these from a distance. In addition to that, the grippers also need to be, the grippers and the manipulators, they need to be sensorized. So for that, we basically try to look at optical fiber-based technologies so that we can have long distance sensors that can transmit these signals over long ranges. So I will quickly show you some brief glimpses of the work we've conducted regarding this soft manipulator, gripper, and sensor for soft grippers. So here is basically an Iversion robot, a robot which we call as Iversion Robot. That's basically like a sock that is folded in. And then when we apply pressure, this basically everts from the distal tip. And then we can embed actuators along the body, which can help us control the direction of this eversion. So an interesting use of this is these can just be placed at the entrance of this kind of walls. Even if there's a very thick wall, it can penetrate through this hole in the wall, and it can access these regions. And since a lot of it is empty with almost negligible sensors inside, this can also be radiation tolerant because this just made of fabric. Yeah. And further from there, we also worked on developing a gripper that is again tendon driven, but then for exhibiting different grasping configurations, we have pneumatic actuation that can basically help it exhibit many different configurations. And as you can see, the gripper can be compliant, and it can basically adapt to different shapes of the object without having prior detailed information about this object shape because of the compliance. Of course, once we have this type of grippers as well as these soft manipulators, an interesting challenge that comes to the fore is that how do we now have the feedback, or how do we sensorize these manipulators and grippers so that we have feedback that is coming back to us on what is the current shape of the grippers and these manipulators, right? So basically to give them a proprioceptive ability. So for that, we looked at developing sensors based on flexible optical fibers. So a lot of the commercial optical fibers, basically they have a core cladding and a cladding. The transmission loss can be very low, and these are quite low cost. And the interesting thing of this technology in general is you can make this from a variety of transparent materials once you have a internal core and an external cladding such that the refractive index of the core is more than the cladding. We can actually make an optical fiber based on this, right? And now the transmitting and receiving optical fibers can be very long, and they can have a very minimal loss, and we can embed some sensing element within this optical fiber that can help us to basically achieve sensing in this soft manipulators and grippers. So what a simple technique that I've developed is that we took these simple optical fibers off the shelf that we purchased, and then we remove the sheath of this optical fiber cable, and then we basically make it rough by some abrasion process. And once we do that, basically this becomes very lossy, so a lot of light is lost from this part which is abraded, right, where the sheath is removed and abraded. Now if we encompass that in a soft substrate like a silicone material, what we can do is we can send in light from one end, receive light from the other end, and by basically just looking at the intensity loss in this transmission, we can characterize what is the bending in this type of sensor. So we can make a simple low-cost sensor using this abraded fiber. As you can see here, when this bends, the intensity of the light that is received from the receiver side, it basically reduces, and we can use that to characterize the bending strain. And we use this method to make this bending sensor and embedded it in a soft pneumatic gripper or soft pneumatic finger. And here is basically the output of this sensorization. So we actuate this by applying different pneumatic pressures, and the intensity of the received light is recorded here, and you can see that it reacts. I mean, it responds quite well to this changes in the deformation. So now we think that we can actually have these long fibers with these optical amplifiers in the control region, and these grippers and manipulators acting even in a hazardous area, and we can send this light signal in and out and basically get a feedback of what the gripper what are the states of the gripper and the manipulator. Yeah, so this is basically a summary of this type of combined soft robotic approach to extreme environments. Yeah, and then finally, I'd like to basically mention a few words about the future vision that we're trying to do here at Sussex in my group, and also with colleagues in the university. So right now, after a lot of this work on actuation and sensing, the main vision that we're focusing on is on developing bio-inspired and intelligent soft robots. So how can we develop soft robots that can sense, think, and act, and then also utilize some functional and smart materials that give them these interesting capabilities such as self-healing, or large stiffness change or shape morphing capabilities, and so on, to achieve some significant functional tasks. And finally, also, how do we address the challenges of distributed sensing and actuation? So how can we embed many sensors and actuators throughout the body, and how can we couple them so that the body itself conducts some level of computation that will help the robot act autonomously in nature? So these are some interesting areas that we're focusing on, and we'd like to apply these to sectors such as manufacturing, surgery and healthcare, and extreme environments to solve challenges in these domains. And yeah, I'm part of the robotics and mechatronics research group in Sussex, and we have many colleagues working on a wide range of topics, starting from surgical robots, biophotonics, mechanical transmissions, controls, human-robot interactions, and industrial automation. So yeah, and I just quickly like to thank a lot of my collaborators in different parts of the world, in yeah, in UK, in Queen Mary, National University of Singapore, US, China, and so on. So, and yeah, so thanks a lot to you all for listening, and yeah, happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Harish. That was fascinating. I thought a subject area that I really didn't know anything about at all.
Thank you, David. Yeah.
We do have some questions.
Yeah.
So I'll read them out. And of course, questions are starting to come in fast and furious now. Firstly, from Richard G. How long could the membrane conceivably last? Is there any fatigue or degradation with each operation?
Yeah, so thanks to Richard for this question. So actually, I think there are two main forms of degradation. Yeah, first is definitely the fatigue of the member of these elastomeric materials, right? With many cycles, which related to fatigue. But besides this, when we actuate it, especially close to with high actuation strains, there can be leakage current, which can also create some thermal behavior, thermal phenomena, which can also degrade the actuator. So for this, there are definitely studies which have looked at both this type of failure behaviors. For the first one on fatigue, as I may have pointed out in the talk, this the actuation mechanism isn't related to some functional material type of functional material properties. It's basically just a dielectric elastomer. It can be any different type of natural rubbers or synthetic rubbers. So we can choose from a variety of materials to choose materials which have basically better or good fatigue properties. Then coming to the thermal degradation, which is actually more significant in my opinion, because the leakage current can cause thermal degradation, which can basically destroy the elastomer quickly. So for this, the most important aspect is to set the operating limits within safe operating ranges. So the thermal behavior or the leakage current basically is exaggerated once you go to very high strains that is close to breakdown. So what we need to do is we need to design the actuators and the actuator configuration, basically the pre-stretch, preloading, and all these, such that, let's say we want 50% actuation strain, we get that at a voltage range significantly below the dielectric breakdown limit. So basically, it's about setting this safe operating voltages and designing actuators so that we have this factor of safety. But the exact numbers, I don't recall the exact numbers on the cycles, but I hope this gives some insight onto this.
Okay, thank you, Harish. Now we have a question from Mike Underhill. He says, is there a problem with electromagnetic interference caused by the high voltages? Presumably worse in freshwater for the jellyfish, as seawater is conductive and so a better screen.
Oh, okay. So EM interference. I'm actually not quite sure, but so I think I can clarify two things. First is for this work that I've showed, there is no communication. It's just wired. It's just wired directly to the voltage source because we're testing this at the actuator level. Then the second thing is there is, for example, the high voltage is quite insulated from the rest of the water. So in this setup I've shown in both the different two types of setups I've shown, the high voltage is completely shielded from the water, but then the water, the fresh water or seawater, it can basically be the other electrode. So it can be the ground electrode, but the high voltage is completely sealed from the water, and we are actuating at 5,000 volts. So if there is room, I mean, if the voltage is slightly different, it is not a big issue. I'm not sure if I got the question correctly. But yeah.
Okay, let's jump ahead slightly to a question from Lizzie Pendleton. For Helios, how does the self-healing work on an atomic molecular level? What's happening to make it self-healing?
So basically, for this, there are several intermolecular forces that help us to yeah, maybe I can share the screen. So, oh, it is stopped. Okay, that's okay. Yeah, okay, I got it back. So basically, there's some intermolecular forces between different interacting groups. So here we have some groups from the fluorosurfactant, and then the elastomer is also a fluoroelastomer. So there are some intermolecular forces that basically help to basically help the self-healing process. But actually, we really cannot, as you may understand, we really cannot see this, for example, sort of like an under microscope type behavior for this. What we can perceive is we actually do some FTIR studies, which basically highlight what groups are active in different, in different mixtures of this fluorosurfactant and fluoroelastomer. We see that in the ones that work, we can identify some groups that are active. So we do not have a direct visual picture, but we can infer that there are basically some interacting groups, the CF3 group here, and then the and another hydroxyl group in the fluorosurfactant, which possibly are interacting, and it's only an inference that we can make. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Harish.
Yeah.
Coming back to Mike Underhill's second question on soft grippers, it says, how fast is the soft gripper? Could it be used for a robot to be able to play a piano keyboard?
Yeah. Actually, I think there's some groups who did exactly this to actually use the soft gripper to play a piano keyboard. So it's as fast as that, and then one of in my slides I showed something called as the new nets, and PNEU UE and ETS. So the concept of this new nets is so that the actuation chamber can be as small as possible, so that the fluid flow can be needs to be very small to get this type of deformation. So there is a lot of optimization already done that makes the actuation chamber for this fluid to be as low as possible, so that the fluid flow doesn't need to be very high to actually even get a large bending strain. So playing a piano, it has been demonstrated, so I think that answers it. um, um, how fast? Definitely, it's not very high speed. Maybe 5 hertz or 10 hertz for this pneumatic, but then the strain is lower at this type of high frequency. For dielectric elastomers, the frequency range is higher. It can be hundreds of hertz, but still, if you want very large actuation strains, then again the frequency will have to be lower depending on the strains. Yeah.
Right, thanks.
Thank you.
Interestingly, in the latest edition of the Engineering and Technology magazine that the IET published,
Yeah.
There's been articles on nuclear waste decommissioning and things. That was quite appropriate that you were covering research that might help with that. And an anonymous attendee has said that one of the issues of using robotics within nuclear environments is the impact of radioactivity on materials and electronic components. How do you think your soft grippers will be affected by this?
Yeah, thanks for the good question. So um, there have been very recent work on testing silicone-based soft grippers in gamma emission environments. But the thing is, it hasn't been tested to a very high dosage. So I think this is something we're quite interested to do. And we also actually tested some samples, but in the ranges that we also have tested, which we didn't foresee were low, there was no significant degradation for this silicone type materials. But the thing with the interesting thing about these soft grippers is we can use, again, this does not depend on any specific functional materials. This can be made from fabrics or different type of elastomers. So anyone finds an elastomer or a flexible fabric that is radiation tolerant, we can make a gripper based on that, using that material. So it's basically you got a material that works. We can make the device based on that material. Yeah. So I think this is this why both the optical um, and the pneumatic based technologies have been interesting to us, because once we got this technological concepts ready, then we can basically search from a repertoire of materials to basically develop similar grippers and sensors based on the materials that are suitable. Yeah, but there have been recent works on gamma testing for soft materials, and I think they're promising, but we're yet to see at high dosage levels.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Harish.
Thank you.
What was I going to say there? Well, we've run out of questions that people have posted. I'm sure if people think of other questions they want to ask, then they can email them in.
Yeah.
Certainly on behalf of the IET Sussex network and our audience, and a good sign of a talk is that the number of people watching stayed constant right the way through the talk. So very well done. You kept everyone.
I'm glad.
Certainly kept mine. So thank you again on behalf of our audience and our members. And to our audience, there will be a CPD, a Continuing Professional Development Certificate, posted up on our website. If you just search for IET Sussex, you'll find our homepage and a link to where you can download such a talk, such a certificate. And I'm just noticing on the chat panel, lots of people saying very interesting material, thank you for the presentation, and thanks very much, and so on. So the audience obviously enjoyed it as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm quite glad and pleased to present here as well to very attentive audience. Thank you very much, everyone. And also, yeah, I'm also happy to receive any questions or further discussions on my. You can look at Sussex webpage to find me. I think, yeah.
Right, thank you, Harish. Well, I know most of our audience don't have to go home; they're already at home, and I know you have somewhere to travel. So,
yeah.
Thank you again. Safe journey home, and
thank you.
Thanks for the evening.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone.